or unhappy or depressed, you're more likely to be, even if it's 4 connections away. So we can study the social network and use it to change healthcare, because we know most of our healthcare problems aren't from our genetics, it's from our behavior, what we eat, how we get stressed. All those things are involved. And so that means we can use social networks in smart ways. And for example, one company in San Francisco has developed a platform for patients who are pre-diabetic. They're about to become full-on diabetics. And they've created a way to create a social network. The scales will tell everybody what they're weighing. They can share their stories. And they've shown using this that they can dramatically lower people's blood sugars and their weights just by using an integrated app and social platform, all right? What if you can use other tools like augmented reality? What if you're trying to lose 100 kilos, 50 kilos, and you looked in the mirror in the morning and it showed you what you're gonna be like if you really worked out and lost weight, right? So augmented reality, the virtual mirror. Or if you went in the wrong direction, what happens, right? If you keep eating the extra dessert, what's gonna happen in 6 months or a year or 5 years? So we can use that sort of rewiring of the brain. There's an app you can download called Fatify, so I can see myself now, and if I gain 50 pounds, yikes, right? So those sorts of things can be powerful ways to change your wiring, right? Okay, what about robotics? Robotics is moving very quickly. What about enabling the disabled using wearable robotics? These are called exoskeletons, and there's several companies now, including one called Exobionics. They can take someone who's paralyzed from the waist down, and they can now walk using these wearable exoskeletons. So in the not too distant future, I think you will have a pair of these at home instead of a wheelchair. If you have a muscle weakness or you're 95 years old, you'll strap on your legs and you go climb Mount Kilimanjaro. All right. The stem cell world, how about the stem cell world, which is what I've spent 10 years or so in, hopefully will cure spinal cord injury, not just treat it with robotics. This gentleman on the right here, Dr. Ishii, won the Nobel Prize last year for developing induced pluripotent stem cells, the ability to take any cell, like your skin cell, and make it a stem cell. And that's going to become very, very powerful for creating new body parts and eventually combining that with 3D printing. This is 3D printing. Celine mentioned this. You can make very complex components today doing this. When we start to combine stem cells with 3D printing, it's going to get really, really interesting. We're already in the era where we can start making parts for surgeries and prosthetics that match the normal leg, for example, or in some cases, making 3D trachea that are seeded with the patient's own cells. So the world of tissue engineering and 3D printing is coming together. Eventually, we might make complex organs, right? Okay, well, all this is dependent upon new systems, how we reinvent, how we pay for things. And if you think about all the things we didn't even have 10 years ago, think about the new technologies that are developing that will enable us to reimagine healthcare. So a lot of what we do at Singularity University is look at these new technologies, where they're heading, where they're coming together. So I chair the medicine track. There's tracks in robotics, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology. In the summer, and we have a graduate here, every student learns all these over several weeks and looks at how to apply them to grand challenges. So there's a 10-week program in the summer. There's 1-week programs as well. And we ask, how can you apply that, for example, to global health or poverty, energy? One example one of the teams developed was the idea of using low-cost drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, to deliver drugs and vaccines. They call that the Matternet, not the internet, but the Matternet. And they've already prototyping this in several countries. And it may be a way to deliver things, maybe a pizza at first, but later it will deliver you drugs and vaccines. One team last summer developed a glove that can enable you to do better physical exams with integrated diagnostics. And because medicine was so interesting to so many people coming to Singularity University, we started a program. We created a program called Future, where we bring together doctors and innovators to think about the future of medicine together. So if you go to futuremed2020.com, futuremed2020.com, you can see a lot of the lessons and takeaways from that program. We're doing a big one in November, so if you sign up there, you can maybe come join us at our next program. Okay. Well, one of the exciting things that we've seen at Singularity University and elsewhere is that new players are coming into healthcare, right? It's not just doctors and nurses and biomedical engineers. It's people from all these fields. So there's new data platforms, there's health hackathons we've had, there's new incubators in the United States that focus on healthcare, and including people from the design world, right? It's not just enough to have the technology, you need to have a design thinking around it. It will never be utilized, right? So there's ways to think about design, particularly if we use lessons from other fields like aviation. I'm flying in 2.5 hours to Miami. I wouldn't just get there by putting wings on my car. I'm hopefully going to have, I wish I had a jet fighter to take. I'm probably taking something like this, but it needs a whole system and design thinking. And I've been a pilot for a long time, and there's lessons from the world of aviation we can apply to medicine. Here's me learning how to fly. I'll just later, I've been a doctor for fighter pilots in the Air National Guard. So there's a lot of lessons from flying high-performance jets and from military medicine that we can apply to healthcare. So for example, one thing we use very effectively in the military and aviation world is checklists, right? Often, sometimes in the operating room, the wrong organ gets taken out. Oops, yeah. So now we're trying to use checklists in the operating room and show that these can be very effective at improving outcomes and lowering costs, okay? And taking lessons from the space station and beyond. That's one lesson, and some of these are now being made into apps, okay? Other lessons would be simulation, right? You want we've been flying more and more, but the accident rate has gone down, right? So that's because often our pilots are training in complex simulators. Now the next generation of doctors and surgeons and nurses are training with simulation and practicing things in very special circumstances, and they can learn over and over again to make mistakes or practice things that are very rare in teams and get feedback and improve. So simulation is happening in many different settings. This is a sim center at Stanford, and you can stress a team fail. Every time they'll fail because you make it so hard, and they learn every time, improve as they go, all right? Another lesson would be heads-up displays. We have the old-fashioned cockpits, now the glass cockpits. Now in the fighter pilot world, we use heads-up displays. We want to see the right amount of information. You need different information if you're trying to land in bad weather or if you're in a dogfight. And you might need some cues. You're about to hit a mountain, and it's going to tell you altitude or pull up, So when you're going in the wrong direction, you can get other information. And I think we'll see that kind of technology come to healthcare. So, for example, you have feedback loops and heads-up displays in some of your cars. It tells you how many kilometers per gallon you're going. What if you had that kind of just heads-up display for your health, kind of a GPS to help you turn right or left and guide your wellness or your therapy? You want just the right information. You don't want too much information. You might get overwhelmed, right? Okay. What about using different ways to see the world, right? There's people developing contact lenses that can help you see the world in new ways, and you've heard of Google Glass, which will be coming out in the next year. Imagine beaming this information to your eyeball, and we made one sort of a mock-up this summer that gives you lots of interesting possibilities. Imagine you're wearing these on a date, right? And you need a little help. You pull up the Wingman app, right? Maybe you get some extra information, right? And so there's interesting privacy and other implications in this as well. But I think we'll start to see interesting applications of the sort of heads-up display technology. But we'll also start to see that, I think, apply to healthcare, right? You can imagine it being applied for the anesthesiologist. It could be applied when you're looking at your diet. Maybe you see it differently. Maybe you get a warning. All right. I'm going to speed up a little bit. There's radar, the idea of seeing where other patients are, and using technologies like this, using the equivalent of driving apps where you can reconstruct the map of Rome just by the driver, know what the right path is. If we can start sharing information amongst patients and seeing where the traffic jams are and the right way to work. So in summary, medicine's changing. We've been kind of blind by the seat of our pants, and we're starting to use new technologies, low-cost genomics, crowdsourced data. We're starting to use maps, social networks. In fact, we can start to tell just by what you're searching on Google where the influenza is, right? And soon you'll start to use your social network not just for friends, but to know, who to shake hands with or not shake hands with that day based on your social network data, right? It's actually real, right? And we'll have dashboards into our own information and health. So think about systems medicine, connected, mobile, and design thinking in whatever you're doing as we move forward. And the big picture is that medicine is going to change from being episodic and reactive to being continuous and proactive. And I'll just show you, where that's sort of going is maybe with personalized oncology. Every tumor will be sequenced, and we can use artificial intelligence algorithms to personalize oncology, for example. So medicine's changing. We have lots of opportunities to take fast-moving technologies and bring them together in new ways. And as William Gibson said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, and it's up to us to take it forward. So the best way to predict the future is actually to go forward and create it ourselves using these. So with that, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Daniel. You better go. Daniel's about to miss his flight, so he'd rather keep talking and miss his flight than just get out of here. Does he have the clicker, or did I steal it? All right. All right. So let me cover a couple more areas, and then we'll take some more questions if you have any. So let me cover neuroscience, because this is one of these areas that's absolutely exploding. This is our old version of the brain, right? We have not had an upgrade on our brain for 50,000 years. If you were using a 50,000-year-old laptop, you would not be very happy about it. It's an old architecture. It uses torrents of data. We've got hardwired biases. For example, my brain and my nervous system, the instant they meet any calorie, it wants to hoard that calorie because my biology does not know when I'm going to get my next meal. I happen to have lots of food out there, but my biology does not know that. So we have lots of biases. We have limited bandwidth. We have chain accelerating, and so we have to upgrade this device. Now, this is our old perception of the brain, that it was this lump of jelly that's happening. But we can actually now, today, have very refined perspective of what's happening in the brain. And it turns out that the brain operates kind of like an OSI stack, which is the computing stack, physical, logical, transport layers, data layers. We have another stack, genetics, membranes and ion channels, neurons and neurotransmitters, circuits, systemic and behavioral layers, all operating on that kind of same basis. Now, fundamentally, we still have absolutely no idea how the brain works. We kind of know that memory sits over here and that the motor cortex is over here. If you ask a researcher studying neurons firing down at the signal level and ask them, how does the brain work? Basically, they go, we have no idea, right? And so there's a big gap between our macro understanding of functions of the brain and the detailed perspective of how it works. The good news is that as long as we can interface effectively with it, we don't need to know how it works. This is Bernoulli's principle, which governs lift in aircraft, right? And we fundamentally don't fully know how Bernoulli's principle works. It hasn't stopped engineering the hell out of it to get very reliable plane flight, right? In the same way, we're hoping to do that with brain. Now, what happens when you can take brain computing interfaces, cloud computing, sensors, AI, storage, feedback loops, gaming dynamics, all merged in, and navigating and interfacing with this architecture that we don't fully understand. So Daniel showed you a couple of these. We now can get these headsets for $100 that give you some sense of what's going on. This is one of my favorites. This is called transcranial direct stimulation. It turns out if you put a high amp current next to your head for 30 minutes, your learning retention doubles, okay? Don't try this at home, and don't give this to your kids. We don't know the long-term implications of it, but they're actually training pilots using this technique today because they found it so effective to work. This fellow is a hacker. He's got a high amp current taped to the side of his head. God knows what that looks like in about 10 years. How many of you are familiar with optogenetics? Right? So this is a classic example of a funky outcome of these accelerating technologies. This is an intersection of genetics, virology, and optics. What they've done here, this field is literally 3 years old. It's brand new. What they've done is they've genetically engineered a new type that happens to be light sensitive. Most neurons will take input from 10,000 other neurons, decide to fire or not, and then that signal goes to another 10,000 neurons or so. In this case, if you shine a light on the neuron, it forces the neuron to fire or inhibit one way or the other. So what they've done is they've engineered this new type of neuron. They've then used a virus to distribute the neuron in the localized part of the brain of the mouse, in the place where compassion sits. This was actually funded by the Dalai Lama, believe it or not. So then now you have these neurons in that part of the brain that are light sensitive. Then they put an optical fiber into the head of the mouse. They turn on a switch, light floods the cranial cavity, the neurons fire, and the mouse becomes uber compassionate. Kind of wild, right? Similarly, if you put that into the motor cortex, they can make the mouse turn left, turn right. And essentially what you're talking about here is mind control over the internet, right? If you extrapolate this out. So pretty freaky at one level. It's already in mice, which is kind of unbelievable. But extraordinary possibilities for treating Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, if we can interfere with specific neural circuits happening in the brain, right? So huge opportunities for this, although it's kind of pretty Frankensteinish to do what they're doing here. By the way, we have an old word for this, which is called marketing, right? We try and create a condition, and if we show you a stimulus, then like a can of Coke, we want you to buy the can of Coke. So what is we've essentially accelerated this old pattern and made it information-based, and we can force feed and force fire these neurons. And so this is a pretty fascinating area. Now, as I mentioned, all of our structures don't fit. 100 years ago, anything that important that happened to you happened almost within a day's walk. And today, something that happens in Tokyo affects us in minutes. And we are not set up for this particular thing. As we get to the economy, they're having some pretty large fundamental impacts. It used to take 20 years to create $1 billion opportunity. Okay? Google took, it took all of history. We created the first $1 billion company in the 40s. Then it took about 20 years for the next few ones. Google took 8 years, Facebook took 5 years. Groupon, whether the model succeeds or not, Groupon got to $1 billion revenue run rate in 18 months. From 0 to $1 billion in revenues in 18 months. Kind of unbelievable to make that. So the metabolism of the economy, and frankly the entire world, is accelerating as we turn more and more of it into information. This is labor productivity. It's been going on a steady exponential graph for over 50 or 70 years. Very steadily, we're upping labor productivity. Now, this is also creating the negative effects of mass unemployment. The Foxconn, there was a Foxconn plant in China where they've replaced a 500,000 worker plant with 20,000 workers and 1 million jobs, right? And so now you have 480,000 people suddenly laid off, and they're not getting new jobs, and certainly not in that company. Okay? As I mentioned, whenever we've seen this economic impacts on specific industries, this is the record business and the music industry, hit a cliff in the early 2000s and then a 10x drop in revenues. This is Netflix versus Blockbusters, which is renting and streaming videos versus renting a physical product. This is probably my best example of how fundamental this gap is between this accelerating world and this linear world. This is Vinod Khosla, who founded Sun Microsystems. He's one of the more famous venture capitalists in the world. And Vinod spoke at our closing ceremonies a couple of years ago. And what he did was he went and did an analysis of the mobile phone industry. We've seen over the last 10 years exponential growth in mobile phones, right? Doubling every 2 years to now 5-point-something billion mobile phones out in the world. What Vinod did was he went back to 2002, 2004, 2006, 2008, and asked the question, what did the industry expert mobile analysts say would be the growth of mobile phones at each of these points? Who was more correct, who was less correct in the predictions? For example, McKinsey's is very famous for publishing a report in the 90s that said that the worldwide markets for mobile phones would not go more than 1 million units. That was McKinsey's making a prediction in the 90s. I think it'll become a legendary thing, like Watson saying there's no more than 5 computers would ever be sold, or Bill Gates' 640K RAM comment. Anyway, what he did was went back and tracked. In 2002, what did Gartner, Forrester, McKinsey's Jupiter predict would be the growth of mobile phones? And in 2002, when he looked at the collective projections of these mobile industry analysts, they said, booming industry, we see 16% year-on-year growth in this industry. 2 years later, it doubled. It had gone up 100%. In 2004, when they predicted what would be the projection, they said 14% is our projection for this industry. 2 years later, it's gone up 100%, so they're pretty wrong. And in 2006, they said 12%. Okay? And in 2008, I'm able to process the fact that you've had 3 doublings in a row of 100% each. They said 10%. Okay? And then it went up another 100%. Now, how much more wrong can you be from 10% to 100%? You can't be any more wrong than that. And these are the mobile industry expert analysts that we rely on for strategic planning, governments base planning decisions, large companies base market projections on this. This is how wrong they are. And you note that every single point on the curve, the experts went out linearly, because we can't conceive of this exponential pace of growth. If I take 30 steps linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 30, I'll get to the other side of the office, and you can project very well, where am I 1/3 of the way, where am I 2/3 of the way in that projection, right? We're very good at that linear extrapolation. If I take 30 double steps, 2, 4, 16, and I get to 30 steps, at step 30, I'm at 1 billion. I'm 26 times around the world, and it's very hard to project where am I 1/3 of the way, where am I 2/3 of the way in that projection, right? We are very bad at that projection, and yet more and more of the world is participating on this basis. So then something happens, it goes along like this, all of a sudden hits the knee of the curve, goes crazy, and then we all say, oh, black swan, right? If you saw the underlying pattern, you would spot it very early. So this pattern, and he showed, by the way, this was not just true in the mobile phone industry, he showed the energy industry and other industries, the experts in that industry all went out linearly in an exponential environment. None of them predicted it. So we have this, because they all look like idiots if they say it, right? So no, they don't want to embarrass themselves, so they come up with some linear projection that they can defend, and then later on they just cover up their tracks, which is what they do constantly. So this is kind of a fundamental cognitive error that we have in our brains, that we're not able to complement and comprehend this pattern very well. I mentioned 3D printing. These are some of the shapes you can do. That's our class ring, which is 3D printed. So if we want a different size, if I gain too much weight, I just say print another size, and the printer just prints it out, right? Pretty cool. And I mentioned the impact on, say, China when you can do this. As Daniel mentioned, we're now 3D printing organs and other things. We have a company that's 3D printing meat and leather and growing that in a lab, right? And within it now tastes terrible for the moment, but it's getting better. It's doubling in its taste every year or so. And so Argentinian beef, we think within about 8 or 10 years, maybe not, maybe not. I had my first steak last night. It was unbelievable. I'll stick with that. The point is, it's making these very large impacts now at a macro level. And what we're finding is all business models are going to free. Chris Anderson wrote this book, Free, 4 or 5 years ago. People thought he was a bit crazy, but we're seeing every business model go in that direction. For example, if you're familiar with the airline industry in Europe, Ryanair, essentially you can buy a €5 ticket if you buy it early enough. And they essentially, all the later passengers pay for the earlier tickets. And so it's unbelievable. In fact, the CEO, who's a little bit crazy, he's Irish, so he's crazy. The CEO has said to the European Commission, I would like to give away all the seats on all my tickets, on all my flights for free, if you will let me do gambling on the seat back, right? Because he'll make way more money by people gambling trapped in a chair for 3 hours than the few dollars he makes on margin on operating thing. Now, they're probably likely to say no, but it's a great idea. Kevin Kelly, looking at this model of everything going to free, has identified 8 ways of distinguishing yourself in a freemium model, right? Immediacy, you can sell interpretation, you can sell authenticity, accessibility, patronage, you wear an Armstrong bracelet, etc. And it's really worth going to read this blog post by him, Better Than Free. He's one of the smartest people, I think, on the planet. And now we're seeing the rise of consumption, where all of these business models of sharing textbooks or hotel rooms or cars is now taking over, where we're sharing products and services rather than buying new ones. Airbnb, many of you are familiar with Airbnb, right? They just got an investment from Peter Thiel that values them almost half of Hyatt hotels. That's a pretty interesting fact there. As we add new information layers to this, it's all new business models are being based on this new economy, right? Google, $250 billion company by essentially manipulating text and now video, right? Facebook, $60 billion company by just digitizing relationships. Groupon and Foursquare attacking the Yellow Pages industry, right? Thank God somebody's doing that. And as we get to the health data quantified self-sensor networks that Daniel talked about and the trillions of devices that we have here that will be out in the world, we'll see the first kind of major new business models coming up in that world. But fundamentally, there's something going on that all of the structures, as I mentioned, aren't set up for this. We run the world today. I've done a talk on YouTube, if you're interested in going to watch that in detail. But I make the point that we run the world today on a series of very top-down, hierarchical male structures, and I mean archetype, not really gender. Judeo-Christian religions, the corporation, usually a man at the top. The military-industrial complex is probably the epitome of that. But if you look at the open source movement, the maker movement, the DIY movement, Burning Man, we're moving to a very bottom-up environment, and we're starting to manage the world more and more on a collaborative, participatory, nurturing way. If you look at the internet, we don't manage it on a top-down basis, right? It's cross-linking, networking, et cetera. It's very peer-to-peer. And the stress that we're seeing in the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Arab Spring, is the stress going from this old top-down hierarchical movement to a much more bottom-up structure. And I think we're going to see quite a lot more stress out in the world this way. How many of you are familiar with Tech Shop? Tech Shop is a fab lab in Silicon Valley, a new model that popped up, where they use, they put $10 million worth of equipment under one roof, and you can go there and make anything you want. So there was a guy who wanted to make set the world record for motorcycle racing. You couldn't buy that motorcycle. He went to Tech Shop and made it himself. And they have laser etchers and 3D printers and cutters and all sorts of things. What's interesting is their model is like an exercise gym membership. So you pay $100 a month, and you have access to all this machinery that you wouldn't have normally at home in the same way that you have an exercise gym. And they don't take any equity in the company. They're just interested in having things built there. Familiar with Square? That was a Tech Shop project. That was created at Tech Shop as a prototype and then built out. And so this model has now democratized access to innovation in a fundamentally new way, right? So that means anybody can go and invent anything and make it themselves, build a few prototypes, and if they're selling, then you create automatic processes and ship it, at least for the moment, outsource it to China or someplace. How many of you are familiar with Kickstarter, right? Hopefully quite a few of you are for Kickstarter. Kickstarter is a website where you can go and pre-buy a product. So if this guy's selling a watch, if more than 5,000 people put money down saying, I want to buy the product, the website will release the money to him, and he can go make the product. Okay, so it's pre-buying of a product. This is actually a real story. This is Eric Mijkowski, who wanted to create a new runner's watch, kind of like the stuff Daniel mentioned. He wanted $100,000 to build a prototype of the watch. He went around Silicon Valley to 20 different investors saying, can you give me $100,000 for my watch? All 20 said, no, we don't believe you. We don't think hardware is the right way to go. We don't think it's seed. So they basically said no to him. He'd raised a small seed round. Now he's running out of money. He went and put it on Kickstarter as a desperate bid to see if maybe he could raise some money on Kickstarter. In 3 weeks, 23,000 people gave him $3 million. Okay? And then by the time he finished 10 weeks later, 70,000 people had given him $10 million. In his original attempt was to raise 100,000. Okay? Now, two things come out of this. The first is that all 20 investors in Silicon Valley are completely wrong, right? All completely missed the boat dramatically because they have no way of gauging this kind of demand. But fundamentally, and more importantly, if you can raise $10 million on a website like this, why do you need private equity? People have pre-bought your product. You've not given away any equity, and now you can go build something. And in fact, if I'm an investor and you come to me with a idea like this, the first thing I'm going to say is, well, have you shown on Kickstarter that there's demand for the product? And if there's not, then maybe the product's not worth building. If there is, why do you need me? And so something fundamental has just happened here. The unique value proposition and the fundamental competitive advantage of Silicon Valley over the last 20, 30 years has been the investment network and the access to capital that exists more than anywhere else. It's just been fundamentally removed. Anywhere in the world, anybody in the world can come up with a great idea, put it on here, and then you don't need to give away any equity in your company. So this is very disruptive It's essentially democratized the funding part, right? So now when you're building a company, you have three risks that investors typically look at. The technology risk, the market risk, will people buy it, and the team risk, the execution risk, can the team actually execute against it? Now, the technology risk today, 10 years ago, you would have to raise 10 or $15 million to go build a company. Now with cloud services and all of it, it's essentially down to about $100,000 or $200,000 you can build a company. So the technology risk has been largely removed. The market risk has just been removed by this, because I can essentially put a product up here, and if people want it, then I go make it. If they don't want it, I think of something else, right? And all it comes down to now is the execution risk. Can you execute? Very simple. And so this is a pretty fundamental change in everything we've thought about in terms of startups and entrepreneurship. And Silicon Valley does not realize, but it's just been fundamentally disrupted, right? So very fascinating dynamic here to watch out for. Let me end on a couple of examples of people that are using this. Daniel mentioned these headsets. So what these headsets will do will tell you what frequency of brainwave you have going on in your head. So if you're urgently focused on driving and somebody's crossing the wrong way, you have primarily beta waves in your head. Okay? If you're focusing on doing email or trying to get some coding done, then you have alpha state frequency waves in your head. If you're meditating, then you have theta wave frequency brainwaves in your head. I don't know if you can see this photograph, but this is a photograph of a screen. This is a guy in the background taking the picture, and this is me with a headset. This is my brain, right? And I'm wearing one of these $100 headsets that tell me what brain frequency that I have there. This is actually one of our alumni from our executive program. This is Will Henschel. He was the lead guitarist for the Eurythmics, the band from the 1980s, as well as a band called London Beat. I don't know that one. Anyway, this is me. What Will is doing, he's composing music that when you play the music, it puts your brain into a focused alpha state. If you need to code or study or work on PowerPoint or churn out some email, you want that type of brainwave. So this is my brain before and after he plays the music. This is before, and then this is after he plays the music, and this is red. It's hard to see here, but you can see my brain is flooded with alpha waves, okay? Now this is pretty dramatic, right? If I can play music and put my brain into a focused state, that's kind of a valuable thing. I don't need Red Bull, I don't need coffee, right? It's a multi-gajillion dollar idea, and he's doing this level of utterly disruptive innovation with a Mac and a $100 headset. That's utterly incredible. It was not possible to do this kind of craziness 20 years ago. In fact, in your labs here, you can do the same level of innovation with just an interesting idea. This is malaria. This is one of our other alumni. Now, we have a major problem in the world today of malaria. We have 200,000 new malaria cases reported every day around the world. Okay? And it turns out it takes an expert about 20 to 30 minutes in a lab analyzing a blood sample to see if there's malaria parasites in the blood, and they actually count it out to see how there is. Now, 200,000 new cases a day, mostly in the developing world, means that most go undiagnosed, vast majority. The disease spreads, and malaria is now killing several million people a year around the world, annually. Okay, one of the biggest killers in the world. This is Miguel Oroz, a doctor who's one of our alumni. You can see he looks a bit crazy, so he fits the profile of one of our alumni. He comes through. When he graduates from Singularity University, he goes to work for the UN and looks at this problem and says, surely there's a better way of doing this. And the UN, in their linear kind of thinking, says, well, we need more experts, more labs, more equipment. That's how you solve this, right? And you need a truckload of equipment and labs and experts because you've got hundreds of thousands of malaria cases. And he, thinking in a slightly disruptive way, says, surely there's a better way. He goes and hacks together a first-person shooter game. This is a real blood sample, and he gives you a little legend to say, that's a parasite, that's not a parasite, that's a parasite, that's not a parasite. You can see I've got 2 correct and 1 wrong here. And you can go to the site, malariaspot.org, and play it, right? It's live. And in 1 month, 7,000 people playing 20,000 blood samples identified 250 million malaria parasites around the world. Total cost? 0, right? That's the disruption that's available to us. Now, to the UN's credit, they made him head of all their malaria labs worldwide. So he's now stuck in Geneva killing. Other than that, pretty incredible possibilities when you can think of things in a disruptive way and bring some of the tools that you have here to bear on some of these problems that we've always thought were utterly intractable. So you take a camera out in the field, and it turns out if 13 people play the game on the same blood sample, they get to 100% accuracy of identifying parasites. Now you don't even need the experts. Right? So pretty incredible stuff. He's now thinking about how can you apply these to all sorts of other diseases where we can do gamification of identifying of symptoms and the diagnostics. So, you know, we're in this world now where all of these technologies are moving incredibly fast. You heard Daniel describe some of them and how fundamentally that will disrupt medicine. I don't know if he showed you the quote from Vinod Khosla, but the quote was that within 10 years, 80% of what doctors do today will be replaced by technology. That's a profound statement in a world that's moving so quickly that 80% of what they do will be replaced. So we have these areas moving very, very fast, driving new breakthroughs. We're digitizing everything, we're dematerializing everything, and we're democratizing everything, right? A farmer in Africa with a smartphone today has more information capability in his hand than Clinton did when he was president. That's a pretty profound statement, that we've gone from the most powerful person in the world to one of the poorest people in the world in less than a generation, right? So the pace, all of this, when you drop the cost so dramatically, it means you can democratize it, and that many more people have access and innovate with it, right? And so this is what we're going to see a great deal of. And as I mentioned in a couple of my slides, as you have this, you also have the demonetization, and you have huge deflationary dynamics going on in these industries, which we're going to have to figure out how to navigate. Now, the future either goes that we don't do anything about this and we end up with a ton of social disruption. We're seeing that with the Arab Spring. We're seeing that with Occupy Wall Street. We're seeing that with the Tea Party movement and others. Or we learn more about these in a world of abundance. Peter Diamandis, one of the founders of Singularity University, has written a book called Abundance, and he shows that if we manage this properly, within 10 years, these technologies will deliver us. Today, we have an abundance of information on the internet, right? But we could also achieve an abundance of healthcare, education, energy in all of these areas if we manage them properly. The problem is our leaders in the world are totally not managing this the right way, because none of them have any awareness of what you've heard today. None, right? How many of you are familiar with the Google car? Right, quite a few of you. Can I just see a show of hands? Google car, right? About half of you. So Google has put all these technologies together and has a self-driving car. It's been around for about 3 years now. The car has gone 500,000 miles on California streets and highways without an accident. Okay, kind of unbelievable. The state of Nevada has just authorized it so that you can have autonomous vehicles in Nevada. Okay, that's Nevada, where Las Vegas is based. Crazy. But California has done the same, Florida's done the same, and this will be reality within the next 3 to 5 years. And what we're going to see now, the model that we have for transportation, which hasn't fundamentally changed in about 100 years, now will operate on this information-based doubling pattern, and we'll start to see dramatic changes in transportation. And just that one project, just the automatic car project, has incredible implications on it. For example, we kill 1 million people a year in traffic fatalities. We've estimated that if you roll out the Google car or something like it, the traffic, or the capacity of existing roads and highways goes up 15 times. Not 15%, 15 times. Because you can have dynamically allocated lanes, you can have a car that's the right purpose, you'd have 90% fewer accidents, etc. We don't need parking lots. You can call a car and it can just come and pick you up when you need to. And we're going to see this all happen literally within the next 3 to 4 years. Right? So pretty fundamental changes happening in that world. I'm going to finish with this example and then we'll go to some questions. This is one of your people. This is Emiliano Cargiman, who's also crazy and doubly crazy because he's Argentinian. Came to our second year and designed a nanosatellite, like about this big, size of a shoebox. And he showed his design to the NASA engineers. He's a hacker. He's not a space guy. But over the summer, he learned about these technologies and designed a satellite. And the idea is to float about 300 of them in orbit, in lower Earth orbit around the world, and be able to provide real-time video imaging to a 2-meter resolution anywhere on the planet. How wild will that be when you can look at anything anywhere on the planet with this much resolution? Interesting applications for parking spots, traffic, crop management, security, et cetera, okay? He showed the design to the NASA engineers. We're based at NASA Ames in Silicon Valley. And the engineers looked at it and said, my God, this is the best design for a nanosatellite we've ever seen. How many years of space experience does this guy have? And we went, well, like 5 days, okay? Because he's a hacker, he's super smart. And he took his thinking and applied it into this world. And the engineer took me aside later, the NASA guy, and said, that can't be right. He must have decades of experience helping him in this. And I went and checked with him, and no, he didn't. He just read up all the existing material, applied it. Now, Emiliano is working down in Patagonia building this out. He launches his first satellite in 2 weeks. And this is probably the most impactful project that we can think of in the world today, when you can open that up and allow anybody to build applications on that, right? So this is happening under your noses here in Argentina. So with that, let me pause. Thank you for your time. Hope it's been fun. We have a few minutes for questions if you have any. Thanks. We kind of covered a lot. What this poor fellow went through in 70 days and what Pablo went through in 7 days, we just did in like 70 minutes. So if you're feeling a bit of dense information that hits you, that's not abnormal, right? Any questions? Everybody's floored. Now you need some alcohol to process those. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, 100 years ago, average lifespan was about 45, right? So some of you in this room are the result of exponential technologies. In fact, all of you, if you went back 1,000 years, average age was about 25, right? And so we've doubled it. We've been doubling it steadily. There's actually in the aging world, it's kind of, Daniel probably didn't mention this being too polite, but I'll mention it. There's a concept in the aging world called escape velocity, which is the point in time where we have figured out treatments for you that for every year that goes by, we can add more than a year to your life, right? And when we hit that point in time, we'll have a class of people that can live for an arbitrarily long period of time, okay? And our assessment of that situation is not a question of if, it's a question of when. And that point in time seems to be about 2 decades away. Some people are saying 15 years, saying 23 years, but literally within many of your lifetimes, we will probably hit that point in time. We've heard it said that the person that is going to live to 1,000 years old has already been born. Okay? So that has that's an inflection point, right? The world will never be the same again once we hit that point. How will we deal with planning, retirement planning, employment issues, healthcare benefits, right? Religions, they're selling an afterlife. Their business model disappears, right? What will religions do in that world, right? Natural resources. Actually, we're very optimistic on natural resources, and I'll tell you why. In the late 60s, there was a book published called The End of Everything or something. It was a very Malthusian book, and it said that it's 1968, where the demand for food is growing exponentially, the population is growing exponentially, food supply is linear, We're going to hit a point within 5 to 6 years, and by the mid-70s, they predicted that there will be utter collapse, that millions of people would die every year from famine, etc. Completely didn't happen, right? Because what they don't take into account is that as the demand grows, our ability to create more and more efficient methods for farming is also growing, right? For example, with synthetic biology and genetically modified foods, we're feeding the entire planet today. And while there's all sorts of fears about the risks of that, because some US corporations are doing very bad things with the patents and stuff around genes, and they're very bad actors, in general, we've already served 1.5 million meals using genetically modified, 1.5 trillion meals around the world using GMOs without a public health issue. Right? And we're actually being, the only way we can feed the planet today is because of that. We see the as the countries get wealthier, then they have less kids. And we see the population topping out at about 9 billion in about 2050, and then it starts dropping after that. And so we're not worried about resources. We're not worried about energy either, because it turns out solar energy is on an exponential curve. It's currently doubling in its capability every 22 months. And today, 2 years ago, it was 0.06% of world energy supply. Today, it's 0.12%. In 2 years, it'll be 0.25%. In 2 years, it'll be 0.5%. And then you're 8 doublings away from 100%, right? So it's possible, and what we've shown, you should remember that first graph that I showed you, once you have an information-based environment, that exponential pace of growth stays. Nothing shakes it off that path, and we're seeing solar operate on that pattern. It means that within about 25 or so years, we could have 100% coverage of energy needs using solar. Okay? More importantly, maybe it takes 35 years, it doesn't really matter, but we're going to hit that at some point. If we get, say it takes 30 years to get to 100% coverage of solar, it means in 32 years you have 200%, and in 34 years you have 400%, because we're on these exponentials. And that's pretty exciting. So we think we're going to see an abundance of solar energy within a couple of decades. In fact, Israel was about to build a whole bunch of nuclear power plants. They changed their energy policy after hearing about some of these patterns, because they said it'll take 25 years to build these nuclear power plants anyway. We might as well wait for solar to just catch up. And so energy and food production and resources we're very optimistic about. We're very worried about the policy side of it, the ability of our governments to recognize that this is happening, and bioterrorism. Because somebody in a garage can hack together a virus that could go after a particular person's DNA, like the president, and you would have no way of stopping it. And that's kind of scary. Our students every summer vote on, after hearing about all the technologies, what are the most dangerous ones, and bioterrorism usually comes out on top. And we don't know quite how to deal with that. So but in general, we found that as you open up these technologies, people tend to do good things with them rather than bad things with them, the vast, vast majority. Okay? All right, any other questions? Yes.
Yes. Please, what kind of information can we get from the site of the university that can help
Or
us?
our website?
Yes.
So we have up on our website descriptions of everything we do and a description of our various programs. We have a YouTube channel, Singularity U, where we've released 30 of our lectures online for free. So anybody can go watch those. And if you follow our Twitter feed, or we have a Forbes, a column in Forbes, and we're constantly showing what's happening, what is the latest breakthroughs there. So if you follow us generally, you'll track quite a bit of what we do. Coming to our programs is expensive, but you can follow us pretty much for free everywhere. Okay? All right. Any other questions? Yes, question here and then a question at the back. Yeah. The application process? Yeah. So the summer process, you can either, we just finished a contest in Argentina to find a great student to come for the summer, funded by Globant. So thank you, Pablo and Globant, for doing that. We've picked a winner, but for next summer, there's an application process on the website. We are able to handle 80 students every summer. We had last summer 4,000 applicants from 120 countries. So it's hard to get in. But you don't get in if you don't try. I mean, he got in, so, you know, if he got in, I'm just kidding. He's going to kill me later. Sorry? Any suggestions? So we're looking for students that have done that have a graduate degree, because we found that people with undergrads or with a graduate degree, you have the academic rigor and discipline to try and absorb all of the knowledge that we throw at you. We're looking for students that have done something leadership-oriented out in the world. They've started a company, they run an NGO, they run a student politics organization, something like that to show demonstrated leadership, because we're not set up to teach that. We're looking for existing leaders. And then we are looking for people that want to solve the biggest problems in the world today. Our basic mission is we have these technologies that are moving very fast, and they can scale to solve global problems. If we don't solve global problems with technology, then we often end up in war. Right? We have 70 armed conflicts around the world today fighting over clean water because we don't have the right desalination and purification technologies at the right price points, or at least not distributed. And so we think technology is a better way of solving those problems, and war is a pretty expensive way of progressing humanity. Right? I think we probably agree with that. So you can apply on the website, and we have also a one-week executive program focused more on the existing leaders, CEOs, investors, government leaders. That's more of our business model. So we charge businessmen a lot of money, and that funds the summer program. And that's basically a similar model. And then the summer, half the summer, as I mentioned, you get a ton of lectures. The other half of the summer, they work on projects to kick out and spin out some of the projects that you've heard described. And because we're not as much about the education is, we want people to act. We want people to go start companies, start research ideas, to go address these challenges, because we need people out in the world demonstrating that this is happening so that everybody in the world sees that this is the change that's taking place. Right? If you think of all the disruption and all the changes in the world over the last 20 years, it's mostly due to internet. Even mobile is just now starting, right? Just in the next 10 years, we have 3D printing, we have big data, we have advanced robotics, we have AI, we have synthetic biology, all coming online. As a society, we are not set up to absorb that pace of change. And people don't like change, right? And therefore, it's going to be very painful from a societal perspective trying to absorb this radical pace of innovation, okay? And even in Silicon Valley, I mentioned the Google car. The California state government just authorized a $70 billion high-speed rail system to connect LA, San Francisco, Sacramento together, okay? Maybe 100 years too late, and maybe kind of old technology. But the Google car will essentially render it irrelevant before they lay the first rail. So it's an utterly irresponsible act of public policy and expenditure to spend so much money on a system that will be out of date before you even start, right? Because they have no awareness. And this is in California, for God's sakes. Imagine other countries like Argentina or Brazil or whatever. We're seeing this everywhere in the world. And so we have our core team and our programs at home. I'm mostly on the road nowadays yelling at people. Like I've been yelling at the World Bank, I'm yelling at the UN, et cetera, as to how to think about this new paradigm. Okay? One last question in the back, and then we'll end it. How do we work out the ethical challenges this all brings? Very important question, and probably the most important reason that we exist. If we knew 50 years ago the damage we would be causing by laying out coal-fired power plants and all of the other things that we did over the last 50 years, we might have done something different, right? So now we're sitting on top of these technologies that are 1 billion times more powerful, and the moral and ethical and constructive use of these is something that we're very, very passionate about. Part of the reason we bring in students, this summer out of 80 students, only 8 are American. The vast majority come from other countries, because if you're going to address a global problem, you can't be sitting there in Silicon Valley thinking about it. You have to do it everywhere. And so we want people to learn about these technologies, and we do a lot of treatment of, like one of our primary tracks is policy, law, and ethics. How will we deal with the policy implications of some of these technologies, the ethical implications? And we try and teach our students to do the constructive and moral and proper thing with these, and instrument all their solutions very heavily so that we can spot any feedback loops quickly and operate against them. We are at one level, we're actually at the better point in humanity than we've ever been in our lives. We have less deaths by war than we've ever had in the history of the world. Extreme poverty as measured by the UN even has dropped 70% just in the last 30 years. Right? You don't see that in the news today because we are geared towards hearing bad news because it sells. You don't hear good news very much, but we're actually in a much better place than we've ever been. But the amplification of the amplitude of the negative consequences of these technologies is growing. And so we have to deal with that very carefully. And it's a huge concern to us, the ethical use of it. And not just by some random terrorist, but by governments. Right? Governments today are using these technologies with impunity to try and spy on the citizenship and spy on other governments, et cetera, et cetera. What is happening, though, and that'll be happening for the short to medium term, but then what will start happening is we will start turning that lens back on the governments. And so we're hoping we'll get to some decent equilibrium at some point. How many of you saw the meteorite coming down in Russia a few weeks ago, right? Did you see all of the news stories about that? And they had all this live video of it from all of the dashboard cameras from all the Russians. Do you know why all the Russians have dashboard cameras? To fight corruption. Because the policeman can stop you and say, I'm breaking your headlight and I'm giving you a ticket for it, and now give me a bribe. And so they all have dashboard cameras to tape the policeman, and if somebody crashes into you for insurance fraud, they can tape them and then do this. So because it's kind of a Wild West in Russia, they are learning to use technology to protect themselves, right? And so I think we'll see a lot more of that type of example as we figure this out. And right now, governments don't want to be transparent about what they're doing. And little by little, we'll figure that out. But it's going to be a painful few years in the process, right? Great. I think we're running out of time. Pablo, do you want anything to say? Do you want to say anything?
No, just thank you so much. Big applause. Basically. As always, great talk. So I think we all are with our minds really open now. Just be careful when you get out and start talking about that. People will think you are crazy. So just, I had a problem. I talked about that once in the radio, and my mom says, "Are you saying you are going to print lettuce? What are you talking about?" So basically, be careful about that. And just thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's great to have you here at Globant and sharing these experiences and these talks with us. There's some beer, Fernet, and some other drinks. Enjoy, do some networking, and just thank you so much.
Well, thanks.